Hey you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 27, second to last episode of this season, and it is a good one. Mr. Bryan O'Hara joins us for a conversation about Tobacco Road Farm, and he is just a wealth of information and knowledge. And one of my favorite elements of this interview is that he talks about several things we haven't talked about. We go over the photo period and solarization, but we also just really get into the sort of history of how they developed their system. That to me was really cool because it's really rather unique, and I loved hearing how long it took and how patient they were and how it all came together. And I think there's just a ton of value in that. And another thing about this interview is that it's a bonus interview, and we decided not to monetize it. In fact, the next two episodes are on us. They are a thank you to you, to the No-Till community. You all have been amazing. We hit our $1,000 a month Patreon goal, and that's going to afford us a second season, starting sometime in September, I think. If you want to continue to see this movement grow, the more money that Patreon accumulates, the more we'll be able to do. The more people I will be able to hire to help me, the more events we can possibly get together, the more content we can generate. We'd love to start a sort of farm lab and test different tools and amendments scientifically and objectively. That's where anything above $1,000 a month will go. And there are perks. Like, speaking of events, we will be hosting Daniel Mays of Frith Farm here in Kentucky in late October for an all-day intensive with him, then a tour and beers at our farm at Rough Draft Farmstead in the evening. Tickets will go live this week, but Patreon members and Venmo donors get first dibs. Tickets will be limited, so just keep that in mind. Daniel Mays was on the podcast. He was the first guest, and his system is very unique. It's very cool contrast to what we do. He uses a lot of cover crops, but he does it on a small scale, and it is super cool. So I hope you will look out for that. Go check that out. That's kind of an incentive to be a Patreon member. There are discounts for Patreon members, so check it out over at patreon.com/farmerjesse. You can always Venmo us a couple bucks at No-Till Growers. I'm not going to harp on the Patreon stuff, but I do want to say a big thank you to a few of our Patreon members, including James Fortier, Connor Crickmore, Dawson Mahalko of Jubilant Field Farms, and Tiffany Jackson of McHaven Farm. These are all Sunlight supporters, and they have found enough value in our work to really keep it going and growing. So big shout out to them and all of our patrons. For real, thank you all so much. Just one last request, if you have not already, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you are getting it, even if on YouTube, so that way you will know when we go live with Season 2 in the fall. Otherwise, let's just enjoy this interview. I've been a big fan of Bryan's for a long time. He helped me out with an article on Korean natural farming for growing for market last year, and his work has been a huge inspiration to our farm and so many others. So here it is, No-Till Market Gardening with Bryan O'Hara of Tobacco Road Farm. Bryan O'Hara, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Jesse. Glad to be here.
And I'm glad to have you. I'm very excited to have you on. I thought first we could just sort of start with you giving us sort of little overview of Tobacco Road Farm. Can you tell us where you're located and sort of how many acres you're working with right now?
Oh, sure. So, Tobacco Road Farm, we're in Lebanon, Connecticut, which is in basically zone 6. We get cold temperatures around a little below zero in the wintertime. Let's see. We've been farming on the land for almost 30 years. We have about 3 acres in crop production. We do a lot of year-round vegetable production. And we do not apply pesticides to the crops. And that's basically been our historical approach. So what that meant is that it's led us down a road of trying to increase soil fertility and plant vitality in order to have the appropriate insect and disease resistance to bring marketable crops to harvest. So we have done that for an extended period of time. The farm is our means of livelihood, so we've depended on the crop production, which combined with trying to control insects and diseases through fertility has led us down a path of dramatic experimentation and development of numerous vegetable growing techniques in order to deal with the modern conditions that are presented in vegetable growing in our region.
It's great. I really want to hear, because you've been doing it for so long and because your systems are so unique, I kind of want to hear the whole evolution of it. Can you take us back to before you were no-till and then give us a sort of arc and timeline of how you developed your current no-till systems?
Oh, sure. So basically, when we started growing vegetables about 30 years ago commercially, it was pretty easy to grow vegetable crops. And we developed along the lines of pretty standard vegetable crop production around here. We had tillage equipment and numerous tractors. And we did things pretty traditionally. We were trained by traditional vegetable growers. And so that was successful at the start of the farm. We did start with relatively poor soils on our farm. They were run down because of previous agricultural techniques. So we did have the difficulty of starting with pretty low nutrient deteriorated soils, but those responded quickly to basic organic principles of composting and some rock minerals like limestone. Nothing really too advanced. And so we just went with traditional organic approaches, and we had very reasonable crop production for a number of years. That intensified over the course of time as we got into year-round vegetable growing under lots of low tunnels and some high tunnels. And so as we started cranking up the production of vegetables off the given land area, we started tilling the soils more and basically just asking more of the soils to produce higher and higher levels of crops over longer and longer periods of time. And so, under increased tillage combined with the deterioration of the overall environment, crops began to suffer. So we started running into more insect and disease problems as time went on instead of less. And so we started adjusting numerous different approaches, which one of the primary ones being tillage, but also fertility programs and everything else that goes along with crop production, basically. But so we started adjusting things as we saw problems starting to arise. So we again basing everything on observation and a lot of trialing of different approaches, a lot of experimentation. It kept pointing to us the way forward, which was to reduce tillage and to switch the fertility program to increase the resistance of the plants to insects and diseases. So what that looked like in terms of the tillage program was, so say maybe 15 years ago, we were just full tilt tillage equipment. We had 5 tractors, we had rototillers, plows, chisel plows, harrows, field cultivators, tined harrows, basically every relatively simple tillage tool available to us. And so we would till the soils in order to get an additional crop. So we would crop a given piece of land 2, 3, or 4 times over the course of the season. And so between each of those cropping cycles was a tillage cycle. Often relatively not expensive. Like we weren't moldboard plowing between each cropping cycle, but basically a rototilling or usually rototilling or a harrowing, and reshaping of the bed surfaces. And we had bed shaping equipment and rollers and things like that. So we were constantly, and we had all the implements mounted on all the different tractors. So it was just one tractor after another, all lined up, dunk, 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 till then we had very straight rows and very straight beds and very smooth bedding surfaces, to aid in the cultivation, and just kind of a standard formula of a tillage system. Pretty intense though. And we kind of prided ourselves on all those things, that we were effective and speedy and efficient and, all those kinds of things. But we of course realized that it wasn't really working, and that so we started reducing tillage steadily over the course of time. There was weeds, there was insect and disease pressure, and we were obviously handling those things to still remain profitable. But we were seeking additional efficiencies and vitality for the crop. So we started reducing the tillage program was one of the approaches. So what that looked like first, really the first move to reduce tillage was to establish a permanent bedding system, so that the wheel tracks remained from one season to another between the beds. And the bedding system looked like basically, there was two different bedding systems. One was a 36-inch bed with an 8-inch wheel track, which the International Cub tractors fit over. And then there was the 58-inch beds with a 10-inch wheel track, which the International Super Cs fit over. And the 10-inch wheel track with the 58-inch bed fit into a 34-inch row cropping scenario. So, and that essentially intermingled with the International Cub tractors, where if we were on the row cropping at 34-inch centers, we could put a Cub tractor onto those fields and do a single row cultivation, or we could maintain a double row cultivation with the Super C tractor. So, but one of the first moves for us was to just stabilize those wheel tracks into basically a permanent scenario, so that every season the tractors went over the same wheel tracks, and that alleviated compaction onto the bedding surfaces and reduced the need for essentially broad field tillage, which would be the moldboard plow essentially. So we no longer started fields just from scratch and plowed areas or retilled large areas at a time, and instead we switched to having specific tillage equipment that fit on top of each individual bed. And so primarily that was rototillers and harrows, and field cultivators and tined harrows, and the chisel plow. So basically when we went to the permanent wheel track system, we eliminated the moldboard plow and purchased or got together equipment that fit specifically onto the two different bedding systems, the 58-inch bed and the 36-inch bed. So we had harrows that fit that, and rollers that fit that, and harrows that fit that, and the rototillers could fit that as well. So that was the first move, and of course we saw positive results from that move. And then we started from there, and this all is occurring over the course of a number of years. So it was probably a 5 to 10 year cycle of tillage reduction, all the time experimenting with even more advanced techniques. Say, no-till, we started experimenting with on a very small scale, quite early on. But it was, this gradual reduction, really, that was primarily what was going on. So, but the next big move from the for reduced tillage was then, once we had established a permanent bedding, we sought to basically get into a scenario where we were just doing very surface, a few inch deep tilling, either with discs and harrows and rototillers and the tined harrows, and occasional chisel plowing. So the bedding would be very shallowly tilled and occasionally ripped to a depth of, with a chisel plow, to a depth of maybe 16 inches. In the occasional chisel plowings, we would seek not to rip the same slot if we were doing it every few years or so. And so we would move where the chisel would run down the bedding system. And then, but of course, there needed to be a lot less chisel plowing in general because we weren't faced with compacting the lower soil profiles with either the moldboard plow or vehicular traffic. So really, it just started ending up with a surface bed preparation, and the rototiller was effective at that. But eventually, we wanted the rototiller being over aggressive on the aggregated crumb structure of the soil surface. We started wanting to reduce even the rototilling onto the bedding surface. So we ended up using more, as much as possible, just disc harrows and field cultivators and tined harrows, combined with the human effort of raking and kind of shining up the bed surface. And then eventually, that didn't last long because by then we had established that the no-till system was really taking over and was giving us the best results. So that was the general reduction. We didn't just get into no-till overnight. It was a years-long development and we constantly were experimenting and seeing the positive results of reduced tillage and eventually even to no-till. So that's why we followed that course.
That's great. I love hearing the history in that way. I think that really gives some great context to it. Can you describe a little bit what that system looks like now?
So really the big breakthrough for no-till came for us because our main difficulty, of course, is how to terminate the cover crop or the previous cash crop that was in place. And so our early work in no-till really revolved around a couple of the more kind of well-known approaches to no-till, which was simply mow off cover crop right at a critical stage of flowering. For instance, the rye. We would mow down the rye, and then we might open up the mown rye stubble with some discs and plant our winter squash into the mown rye stubble. And we had some success with that approach. There was definitely some slug difficulties in it. Then another basic no-till approach that we used early on was a winter-killed cover crops. So oats and peas overwintered, lush growth in the fall, dies back in the winter period, and then we would seed or transplant in the early spring into the stubble that would have been killed by frost conditions. Or another simple approach was simply heavily mulched bedding surfaces. Then we would rake aside the mulch or transplant directly into the weed-free mulched surface, maybe over winter, or say a tomato crop that had been pulled out. The tomato plants are cut off at frost, and then fall planting in the place where a heavily organic mulch was in place. So those were some of the early work in the no-till. Some of them were very successful. But really, we needed some way of terminating the crops, which was our stay in a position with one of those conditions. So the big breakthrough for us came with solarization, where we figured out that if we mowed off a crop or a cover crop and then covered it with a sheet of clear plastic for a very short amount of time, it could scorch off the growth of the given annual cover crop or crop and allow us to quickly cycle into the next crop, either transplants or reseeding. So the tremendous breakthrough for us was the realization of solarization. We had experimented with some black plastic covering as well, but the clear plastic covers were much quicker because of their ability to heat faster. So we started going with very quick clear plastic solarization, which was very effective under sunny conditions. And that basically requires about 75 degrees and a sunny condition for the mown crop residue, the stubble still alive, for it to effectively solarize. And so that opened up for us basically the period from May till early October to be able to lay clear sheets of plastic and achieve a very quick solarization event that then allows us to come in there with the next cropping cycle. We combine that with, since we're no longer under tillage, events that we started a surface application of composts and mulch materials. So, and those materials, being that they're just applied to the soil surface, are also very useful at inhibiting weed growth, as well, of course, as supplying necessary nutrients for the crop. So really it was a combination of solarization, which freed us up into a much quicker cropping cycle, combined with the more aggressive use of mulch materials on the soil surface, that got us into a very successful no-till cropping cycle that we've basically been working with for the last maybe 7 or 8 years, and just refining those systems that were established at that point.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit? I know it comes up a lot when people talk about solarization. Can you talk a little bit about whether or not the solarization is harming the microbial life?
Oh, sure. So, one of the reasons we like clear plastic solarization is its speed and rapidity. So, if the temperature is 80 degrees or more, we can mow a crop off, put a clear plastic down, and achieve termination of that stubble sometimes within hours, often a 24-hour period, depending on the temperatures in the crop. So we like the very short amount of time that the clear plastic solarization gives us. And so there's a number of difficulties with, of course, solarization events, and that is how they heat the soil surface. So a longer period of time, of course, is going to give you more potential for soil microbiological damage. Solarization historically has been used for longer periods of time in order to sterilize soil surfaces, and kill weed seeds even in the soil surface. But that's all to the detriment of the soil microbiology, of course. So when we solarize under the clear plastic, we essentially, when I measure the air temperature under a well-secured cover, it basically gives us somewhere around 50-degree heat gain. So a 75-degree day will be up around 120, 130 125 degrees. And that is sufficient to quickly kill off the freshly mown annual residues, weeds, cover crop, or crop, but is not sufficient to kill off a perennial weed, and it does not seem to damage any kind of biology that can move at least somewhat into the soil. So whereas there's no earthworm death or no noticeable death to any kind of the larger biology that I see in the soil. However, some of the surface insects can be killed. Certainly, it is very detrimental to slugs, and so you damage certainly some of the biology of the soil. Now, I haven't taken tremendous temperature readings, but I remember when I looked at the soil at about an inch into the soil, and I believe on the day that I was getting a 50-degree heat gain under the tarp, clear plastic. It was less than a 10-degree temperature jump at 1 inch in the soil. So that's just kind of a rough idea of the temperature differential, which certainly is going to affect some of the microbiology, but compared to the damage that a tilling would do to the soil microbiology, it seems to be much less. And certainly that it seems to be true in terms of the ability of the crops to grow. We have a higher earthworm count than we were under a tillage system. Tillers, of course, could easily kill earthworms, just as an obvious example. Although it is potentially damaging, there is no signs that it isn't a dramatic improvement over the tillage system that was in place. On top of that, there is, of course, the concerns of the actual plastic materials leaching into the soils itself. So that's another reason why we go for as quick a solarization as possible. So the shorter amount of time, the better. Not that the soil can't decontaminate various toxicities that might get into it, but there's no reason to challenge the detoxification abilities of the soil by leaving the plastics in place for a longer period of time in that regard either. So let's see. Is there anything else to say about that? Oh, but that is why we shy away from longer-term black plastic solarization. There's certainly definite ramifications, especially under long-term solarization events, to the ability of the soils to breathe, for the soils to maintain a natural air and water balance. And so sometimes, a tarp can be beneficial to run off excessive moisture. But in general, when you start covering soils with an impermeable, at least mostly impermeable surface, like a sheet of plastic, a lot of potentially detrimental things can start happening. So we certainly seek to keep that at, it's a definite management technique to keep that as short as possible. So in that regard, if we get a 95% solarization of the material in a few hours or a day or something, we would much rather pull the tarp off and finish hoeing off or eliminating whatever residues were not solarized than leave the plastic in place for an additional solarization day that could be, offer more damage to the soil.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There's definitely a lot of advantages to the plastic. I think of being able to flip those beds really quickly, reduce maybe your microbial damage that might come from a long occultation, and then, yeah, I think that's really interesting in terms of microbiology, that you want those mycorrhizal microbes to still be alive when you plant something. And if they're still feeding on the root systems of what you just killed, then when you shove another plant in there, they're ready to go.
Right, exactly. So just look at that scenario where if we mowed off, solarized in the morning, the vegetation could be dead by evening, and we could be setting transplants on the same day into a soil and a soil microbiology that's been adjusted to having growing plants in place. Because for us, the two main ways to keep the soil functioning is to kind of enter into the cycle of life and death in the soil, which is, the decay gives the life, and the life gives the decay, and so the soil's cycling in this life and decay. Well, we seek to plug into both sides of that, essentially, as vegetable growers, where we're trying to increase as much as possible the plant growth, the photosynthesis on the soil surface, with keeping the soil as covered with as many crops or cover crops as possible at all times of the year in as close a proximity as possible, and at the same time feeding the decay cycle by the addition of compost and mulch materials to also enhance the decay cycle as well. So we kind of try to plug into both sides. And so the very quick solarization tremendously increased our ability to be able to get more faster turnover of the crop and more living organisms in a less interrupted cycle. There's tremendous advantages in terms of speed of turnover, because when we're under a tillage system, of course, there would often be a delay in the actual, you till in a residue, you need to allow that material to decay, especially if it was excessive. And so often, turning in a cover crop would delay us. There was always delays in terms of weather events, with soils being too wet. Obviously, soils could dry out easily too under a tillage system. So the soils are never too wet to have a mow them off and solarize them, and so it just keeps the cropping cycling much quicker, which of course has dramatic ramifications for profitability as well as for the soil life's ability to keep functioning.
Yeah, that's great. Can you describe a little bit how you do kind of a different direct seeding method than a lot of people? Can you kind of describe how you seed crops?
Sure. So once we have, let me mention part of how we select our seeding method has to do with the lack of weeds. So once we got into this quick solarizations and the mulching with a generous amount of organic materials, then we had much less weed growth. In fact, tremendously less weed growth. So, and I must say that, in terms of effort, the ramifications of no-till on weed control are very extraordinary. I mean, there was tremendous other benefits, increased crop growth, higher yields, less irrigation, but the lack of need for weed control was just extraordinary. So, and just to finish off with solarization in terms of weed control too, I should mention that if we are still, like, you're just getting into no-till and you're using solarization, another potential useful approach is to solarize a crop or a cover crop, then pull the cover off after effective solarization, allow germination of a weed cycle, and then reset so that might take a week or two, depending on irrigation or rain or time of year. Allow a flush of weeds to germinate, reset the plastic tarp, in that case for a very short amount of time, because small weeds solarize very quickly, and then pull the tarp. So you can certainly do a second solarization to eliminate a first flush of weeds. That can be very useful. But basically, the level of weeds kind of determines the seeding method, because obviously with a heavily mulched soil surface with layered materials like I'm talking about, there's much less opportunity for cultivation. So you can still cultivate. Generally requires more finesse, use of hose and human effort to carefully, and hoeing is not particularly easy in a high residue environment either. But essentially, if we still have weeds, or if people still have weeds, or just entering into a no-till system, you may well want to just continue with regular in-furrow seed in lines. So what that looks like for us, usually, since we're talking about a high residue condition on the soil surface, we have to rip a furrow first with either a tractor mounted with some shovels on the cultivator frame, or just simply with a hoe. And so we pre-rip furrows through the high residue environment, because we just have hand push seeders, and then we just run the seeder down the previously ripped furrow. So if we're gonna, at this point, if we are gonna seed in lines and furrows, we pre-rip, and so it's an extra step compared to when we were under a nice clean tilled bed surface. We could just run the seeders down it, but now it requires that extra step. So we still do that with a number of crops: sweet corn, winter squash, pole beans, even beets will still seed in lines because they're pretty large seed. So basically, the larger seeded crops are crops that require trellising or various other factors. We still rip furrows and run a seeder down. But the vast majority of crops, given the incredibly low weed pressure, we can now broadcast seed onto the bedding surface. So what that looks like is pretty simple, just tossing seed out onto the soil surface, but yet it requires the finesse of knowing basically the volume of seed that you're putting down to the given area. And so we have charts, and we record this on the planting tags and things like that, how much seed goes down for a given area. And usually we put that in terms of 30 square feet. So say we're seeding a sixth of a fluid ounce of lettuce seed onto a 30 square foot area, which would be 10 by 3 so 3 foot on a 36-inch bed, 10 feet of it. Say the bed's 120 feet long. Then we would be putting down 2 fluid ounces of lettuce seed that's for a cut salad green for lettuces. So we measure the rate, the volume of seed to the given area for broadcast seeding, and then we simply, after composting the bed surface, which usually happens to at least some degree, we'll put a little bit of compost on the bed surface after solarization. Let me just describe that in general. So the bed's solarized, we pull the plastic off of it. We immediately reseed. Everything goes very, very quickly because for a number of reasons that I described. And so as soon as that plastic is pulled off, the beds are composted, sometimes not composted, but generally composted with a relatively light compost application in this case, because the soils are already high organic matter and very highly functioning. When we first switched into no-till, we initially came in with a relatively heavy compost application, probably about an inch of material on the soil surface. But at this point, a light compost application and then we scatter the seeds into the compost residue soil mixture by walking down one side of the bed, scattering the seeds as consistently as possible. We're measuring. When we get a quarter of the way done, we've used a quarter of the seed. When we're halfway done, we've used a half of the seed. And so we lay the seed down on the bed, walking up and down the beds and scattering the seed into the mixed material of the bed surface. Then, once that is achieved, we drag the seed, and we have various drags. The primary one is a bar with a bunch of grain drill ring drags, which are just looped pieces of circular chain ganged together, and they drag along the bedding surface and churn the soil compost residue mixture about, and the seed is worked into that mixture. We have other options that we can use as well. You can use just a simple tined rakes with the tines straightened out, like a leaf rake or a mulch rake. Just basic or rolling cultivator type of tools, and we also have the rollers still in place to kind of smooth the bedding surface and crush the clods and get the better seed to soil contact. So we have numerous tools for basically just kind of churning the seed into the soil surface, and then we very lightly mulch over the compost seed mixture with a combination of leaf, wood chip, and straw. And depending on what seed it is, can handle various volumes of mulch. A larger seed can handle a little more mulch, or smaller, very, very light. And actually rolling would take place after mulching. And then once the mulch is in place, we immediately water that seed. And that is all for a bunch of different reasons. And that would be obviously the wetted mulch and the compost mixture and the residues all provide an excellent environment for germination, but it all happens very quickly in that order also to maintain the viability of the compost that is very prone to drying out and being degraded in sunlight and wind conditions. So the mulching and the irrigation not only are to benefit the seed, but also to benefit the compost application.
That's so interesting. I feel like I'm probably not the first person to ask, but do you have density issues with how it's spread?
So, of course, as I said, you want to be careful. And it, like most things, requires a level of finesse, both with scattering the seed and with the dragging and with the mulching. These are things that need to be paid attention to. They need to be done correctly and carefully. So with that in mind, that all those things are done carefully, and then combined with our marketing system, which is tolerant of various sizes of, say, carrots. I'll just use carrots as an example. I do not need every single carrot to be the same exact size. I can have a carrot that is maybe 3 or 4 inches long, or a carrot that is 8 or 10 inches long. And so where we market, which is the grocers, the restaurants, farmers markets, I'm not beholden to needing exactly the same size carrot every time. So I have a certain flexibility that you need to understand from the marketing perspective. The carrot cannot be too small, however, that it is not palatable. But with our ability to choose seeding rates, we have never really run into conditions where we have to thin a crop because it's too thick, and rarely do we ever get a condition that is too thin. So in other words, if the carrots don't all come in a certain area, generally the carrots just get bigger in that area. If they're a little denser over there, they're a little smaller, but they're still marketable. And when we look at the overall yield per area, there's like a certain window in between which you can have smaller carrots and still yield about the same rate per area, or you can have larger carrots and still yield the same poundage per area. You know what I mean? Kind of, you have this window. So as long as we're hitting that window, it's been very successful. So, but occasionally, of course, things can happen, and you'll get a poor stand. However, I don't think that with broadcast seeding, I'm getting worse stands than when I was under using tillage and seeding equipment. You know, sometimes I get a poor stand using seeding equipment. So I have not experienced difficulties in that regard, and quite the reverse, actually. The beds are much more fully covered, and the crops are able to, instead of being all crunched into a single row with all their roots so closely together, you're able to maximize the bed surface area for a much higher level of production. Some of the crops are phenomenal in how, like carrots are a great example of that, or scallion. So many carrots or scallions can fit right next to each other. And so instead of having to separate them for weed control methods, so yields can be very, very high with broadcast seeding, as long as, you know, you have all these different factors all, you know, taken care of, and you're careful about your approach. You don't have a lot of weeds you're going to have to deal with. And so it's been quite the reverse, with dramatically actually increasing yields. And that's why, of course, we primarily go with broadcast seeding. It's also really quick. You know, running the seeders up and down the field, you know, we grow basically every vegetable, so there's a large diversity of crops, and to reset the seeders and the seeding equipment, you know, we did it, and we could certainly do it again, but it certainly goes much faster, broadcast seeding in general. So, however, you know, I do encourage people, again, when you're first getting into it, definitely consider still seeding in rows in order to be sure, you know, that you need to cultivate. You can still cultivate to some degree and things like that.
Right, that's great. Feel free to tell me if you don't feel comfortable answering this question, but I always feel like it's good for context. Can you give us an idea of what you're able to gross with these methods per acre?
It's really variable, because yes, some of the areas, of course, are just grow one or two crops a season, and then we have other areas that grow year round and you know, 4 or 5 crops or something a given season. But generally, I would think at this time, if it was very intensively grown, you know, in other words, year-round vegetable production on a given acre of land, you should be able to achieve about, well, obviously that depends on your markets and things too, but generally about $100,000, I would think, would be reasonable. And, you know, it's hard for us to say exactly, you know, what's what and where various, you know, income comes from in terms of that. But that's my general impression. And, of course, there's huge variables, you know, because I know growers that are, you know, isolated and they don't have markets that pay nearly as well. And I know growers, you know, that are in really lucrative markets, you know, very close to urban environments and things. So, you know, I consider us to be somewhere in the middle of that kind of condition.
While we're sort of on seeding, I was wondering if maybe you would describe something that I heard you talk about once, and it's this seeding around the winter solstice, and I think you called it the photo period. Can you describe a little bit about what that is and how you do it?
Sure. So this gets into a really interesting subject of how growers need to be able to control and understand there's basically polarities in growth in crops between sizing of a vegetable and its leaf growth and its amassing of size and weight and its response to flowering, which brings to fruit and seed production. And those conditions are important to really understand and be able to manage in your crop production. So in other words, you want your cabbage head to be large, amass itself a lot of leaf, and not bolt. And you want your pepper to be have a sufficient size, yet come to maturity relatively early so that you can bring in your red peppers to market much earlier. And often growers don't really understand that their actions largely impact those conditions. So when we're looking at a crop, we're constantly moving it in a certain direction, whether it's towards bulking or towards fruiting. And so, those kinds of overall that overall guidance is really important to understand. Now, one of the primary things, though, and there's numerous factors that control the flowering response of crops, but probably, I believe it is the primary factor for a large volume of vegetable crops is photo period, in particular day length versus night length. Usually it's actually the night period that most influences most crops. The length of the night period signals the flowering response. Probably second to photo period is warmth. Some crops require a cold period in order to come into fruition, into flowering. But for vast majority of crops, it really is the photo period, it seems, from my experience. And so what that means is that, first of all, growers should understand that basically they're working with two different types of vegetables. You've got your summer annual and you've got your winter annuals. The summer annuals that we grow are usually frost intolerant, and their growth starts in the spring, and they create a fruit and a seed that is mature by fall frost conditions, essentially. So they live for a period of maybe 6 or 8 months, and they've completed their life cycle in that period of time. Squash, cucumbers, tomato. Well, you get the idea. So then, but now the winter annual is the one that most growers don't really understand, and that is that a large volume of crops that we grow are meant to essentially start their growth in the summertime, amass some form of overwintering portion, whether that's the root of a carrot or a hunkered down cabbage head or usually roots or heads, or low growing rosettes of leaves along the ground. So the plant produces some overwintering portion that is then able to overwinter the plant. So, and then the plant comes into spring and bolts and lays down its seeds usually around July after the summer solstice, and the growth cycle starts again. So that is basically all the crops that are winter hardy. So your umbelliferous family, your carrots, parsnips, your cabbage family in general. Maybe I'll talk about that a little bit more. Onion family, alliums. So what that looks like then is basically at the winter solstice, the dark period starts to diminish. And that is the signal for the overwintered plant to come into flowering in that period of spring. Now, a winter annual sown in after the winter solstice will not bolt because, in general, often I have to talk in generalities, but this is, in general, the vast majority of them will not bolt because it has not gone through the opposite cycle of light or darkness gaining after the summer solstice. So what that looks like then is a carrot sown in January or February does not bolt. A carrot sown in October, which comes up and grows under the period of darkness accumulating, has gone through the accumulation cycle, comes into spring, and bolts. So a carrot can complete its growth cycle in a short amount of time as a summer annual in 6 months. These in October and bolt in the spring. And so crops that are normally thought of as biennials aren't really biennials. They are generally annuals that can have very short growth periods or a little more extended because they're started in the winter or spring and require going through that whole cycle of increasing darkness. So what that means for our cropping is that since we grow vegetables year-round, the carrot cannot really be started in October because it's not going to size its root large enough before it reaches the flowering impulse. Now, there's certainly some varieties, and this is all kind of variety dependent too. There's a couple varieties of carrot that potentially won't bolt quite as badly. They've been bred for that condition, and the same is true with onions. But basically, if you want to be sure that your onion, your leek, your carrot, your beet, your chard, your kale, your cabbage are not going to bolt in the spring, they need to be started after the winter solstice period or somewhat close to the solstice period. Because if you take the case of the carrot, again, a carrot sown in November takes usually several weeks to germinate. And by the time it actually germinates, the sun has reached a static pattern at the solstice. And so usually you can kind of push, your winter annual crop back into November, again, variety dependent, and not have a bolting response in the spring. Now, vice versa, in the summer, the summer solstice is an important triggering point for a lot of crops as well. So take like a radish or cilantro or arugula. They all rapidly bolt in the spring when the darkness is deteriorating or becoming less. However, when we start getting into the period after the summer solstice, and again, solstice is a very static period, so it takes usually a few weeks really for the response to really get going. But static in terms of day and night length is very stable for a number of weeks during that period. So, but after the summer solstice period, crops are much more, or those crops I mentioned are much less likely to bolt. So all of a sudden you can seed your radish, you can seed your cilantros, again, variety dependent to some degree, and have a much lengthier period of harvest. And so it's just very important to keep those cycles in mind and really understand when they're going to be the most successful for your cropping. Now, granted, planted. Everybody loves a radish in the spring, but a radish, when we seed them in spring, we are seeding them totally out of their normal, what would be their natural life cycle of starting their growth in summer, making that root for overwintering, coming into flowering in the spring. And then of course seed production by late spring. When we seed a crop in early spring, we are totally out of whack with its normal growth pattern. And although it's an important crop to grow in spring, we're faced with many challenges because of that condition. So the plant, of course, wants to bolt immediately, has numerous issues with insect pressure on it, which don't frequently occur, since much less root maggot, much less flea beetle difficulties when you're grown in the late season. Just for some examples, and I would point out another interesting example of that is flea beetle, where since we're overwintering so many crops, we've demonstrated numerous times where if a crop comes through the winter, and we've done this, I believe, with mustard greens and some Russian kales, and where an overwintered brassica green that started its growth in fall and comes through till spring and is still growing in April is inherently highly resistant, in our case, completely resistant to flea beetle attack. Now, when we've seeded those crops, the exact same seed, right next to the overwintering plants, the mustard green or the red Russian kale, again, seeded out of its natural context, are heavily or can be heavily attacked by flea beetles directly next to an adult overwintered crop that is completely untouched by the flea beetle.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And in fact, it's funny because it makes me think about myself in the middle of the summer. When I get to that July period, I stop thinking about things like cilantro and radishes because they don't work very well in June here in Kentucky. It's too hot. So I just stop bothering. But under that idea of the daylight sort of starting to fall and taking, advantage of its life cycle, that makes so much more sense to start thinking about those crops after the solstice.
Yeah, way easier to handle.
Well, Bryan O'Hara, this has been an absolute pleasure.
Ah, great. Yes, likewise.
All right, if you enjoyed that episode, we have collected some of O'Hara's work that's online over at no-tillgrowers.com. He often contributes to Growing for Market magazine, among other publications. He's got some other stuff in the works. I may tease it at the end of this episode. And speaking of Growing for Market, I just want to say big thank you to them, to Andrew Mefford in particular, who has been super supportive. His book, The Organic No-Till Farming Revolution, is a must-have if you enjoy this podcast. O'Hara is actually featured in the book, as are many of our guests. Also, huge thank you to Neversink Tools and Farm Course and Connor himself, who has been extremely generous and supportive. Thank you to PaperPot Co. and Diego Footer, who's offered me some great podcasting advice and also been very supportive from the very beginning. And thank you to Banner Greenhouses for sponsoring us this year and growing such killer plant starts. All of these sponsors helped get this thing off the ground. None of them hesitated. They all believe in what we're doing, and I hope you will support them back for that. Also, a huge and well overdue thank you to Hannah Crabtree, my wife. Seriously, the show would not exist without her taking on extra work so I can go out into our cooler and chat with farmers. That's real. That's really where I record the majority of these podcasts, in our coolers. And it gets pretty cold sometimes. But anyway, big thank you to her. She is the keystone, and she holds this whole thing together. So if you ever see her, say thank you. Otherwise, you all, please subscribe to this podcast. Thank you for listening. One more week left, then we'll farm our butts off for a few months and get back to it in the fall. Cool? Cool. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Hopefully, maybe we could do this again when you go to
publish?
Oh, yeah, that sounds like a good idea.